and welcome back to our 10th episode now, I think, of the Medicine Sessions and the second of our Women's Voices series. Today we're honoured to be joined by both Dr. Sharon Blackie and Ruby Reed. For those of you that don't know Sharon, she's an award-winning writer and internationally recognised teacher whose work sits at the interface of psychology, mythology and ecology. Her highly acclaimed books, courses, lectures and workshops are focused on the development of the mythic imagination and on her reverence of our native myths, fairy tales and folk traditions to the personal, social and environmental problems we face today. As well as writing 4 books of fiction and non-fiction, including the best-selling Woman's Rose Rooted, her writing has appeared in The Guardian, The Irish Times, The Scotsman and more. She's been interviewed by the BBC and other major broadcasters on her areas of expertise. So thank you so much for joining us today, Sharon.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Interviewing her is Ruby Reed of ADVAYA. ADVAYA explores the connections between ecology, spirituality and mental health, advocating regenerative narratives and economies, collective responsibility, public awakening and mobilization. By embedding ecological awareness into our lives, we can move forward from narratives of growth to an economy that values social, individual and environmental well-being. Their live events, media platform and campaigns shift narratives, empower and inspire, weaving stories of beautiful transformation, resistance and renewal. So thank you so much for joining us as well, Ruby. And with that, I'll hand it over to you guys.
Thanks so much, Zach. That bio always sounds very elaborate. We can get quite carried away with our adjectives. But yeah, it's such a pleasure and an honour to be able to be here this evening with Sharon Blackie as part of the weekly medicine sessions. All of our work as ADVAYA has been enormously inspired by Sharon's writing, her many books and her teaching. Sharon's emphasis on the role of re-enchantment or a falling back in love with the earth and the role of the imagination within the journeys of personal and planetary transformation is a vision that we really share and has been a huge inspiration to our understanding of how we relate to ourselves and the world around us. We've been moved by the idea that if we want to change dominant life-denying cultural mythology and narratives that are failing people and planet, that we need to begin by transforming the stories that each of us chooses to live by. I was really struck by the idea that we can look to ancient myths of the wisdom traditions to tie us back into a deeper sense of belonging to the earth. And likewise by the idea of how we can work with myth and archetype to discover a sense of purpose and the role that we can play in these important times. So this evening, we're going to be exploring the role of women in the ancient traditions of Britain as intermediaries or voices of the land and voices of the otherworld, and as upholders of balance or this kind of contract between humans and the land. And we're going to look at what happens when the contract is broken, ideas of the anima, mundi and the imaginal, and how we might look to reclaim these ancient roles today. So Sharon, it feels fitting now to hand over to you and please add to anything that I might have missed in the introduction. And if you would share a story with us to illustrate this idea of balance.
Thank you, Ruby. You've put it brilliantly as always. I couldn't have put it better myself. That focus that I try to bring to my work. And yes, I would like to begin with a story because I always think of stories as kind of boats or vessels that carry us down the magical river to the other world. And I hope that we're going to spend some time this evening in that liminal zone. And so let's begin with a story which is very old. I'll tell you a little bit more about it after I've told you it. It's a very old story from our native traditions, probably of the west of England or Wales. It's not entirely clear which, but it is a story that begins in the kingdom of Logres, because that was what this land, the west of England, was called in those days. And in the kingdom of Logres were all the riches of the world, and they all came from the court of the Fisher King. Gold and silver, splendid furs, nourishing foodstuffs, beautifully woven cloth, the people of the land did not lack for comfort and health and beauty. But more than that, from the court of the Fisher King, also came falcons and merlins, goshawks and sparrowhawks, wolf and bear, badger and fox, all of the beautiful wild things of the land. In those days, when the Fisher King's court could still be found, there was such an abundance of riches throughout this land that everyone was quite awestruck by it. So yes, the kingdom of Logres was rich and beautiful, and the land offered nourishment for all, for it was properly tended and cared for by the people. Because it's a contract, you see, between people and the land. You care for it, and it cares for you. And the source of the kingdom's life was the life-giving blood which surged in its veins, and it was the sacred water of the wells. And these wells flowed up out of the deep, potent waters of the Otherworld into this land. And the wells were tended by maidens, and these maidens were the voices of the wells. And this is how the maidens served. If a traveller in need should be passing by a well, in those times, a well maiden would come out of the well and ask him what he required. And if he asked reasonably, she would offer him the food that he liked best and a drink of otherworldly well water from her golden grail. And this gift was given freely to everyone in the spirit of service to the land and to the people. But then there came a king in the land who did not cherish the old customs or understand his contract with the land and the duties of hospitality which travel both ways. And that king's name was Amongon. As king, it was Amongon's duty to guard the land and those who lived on it, for it was his duty to tend it and see that everything was kept in good heart, because this is the sacred contract which maintains the balance of the world. It was his duty to keep the well maidens safe, for they were the voices of the wells, and without the wells the land would lose its heart and its life. But Amongon was not much of a man for duty, and the day came when he broke faith. On that day a well maiden, seeing him pass by the well, came out of her well and offered him food and offered him drink from her grail, as was the custom. After eating the food and drinking the water, Amongon tore off her white dress, threw her across the stone wall which surrounded the well, and raped her while his men looked on. But it didn't stop there. After this violation, Amongon stole the well maiden's golden vessel to keep it for himself, but it did not stay with him, for the well maiden's grail might not remain with such men as him. But he carried the maiden off and made her serve him. So seeing what the king had done and taking their lead from him, all around the country the king's men began to rape the other well maidens. So the maidens no longer came out of the wells, and they withdrew from the land altogether. And so it was that the people of Logres lost the voices of the wells, and the services of the wells ceased. This is how the land was laid waste. The leaves on the trees shriveled and died, plants withered, fields and meadows turned brown, and the earth lay barren and scorched, and the waters of the land diminished, and the wells and rivers ran dry, and no one could find the enchanted court of the Fisher King, who had once made the land bright with its treasures. The story says the kingdom turned to loss. The land was dead and desert in such wise that it was scarce worth a couple of hazelnuts, for they lost the voices of the wells and the damsels that were therein. So that's the story. It actually appears in a continuation of the story of Percival, or the story of the Grail, which was written down by Chrétien de Troyes in France in the 13th century. And Chrétien died before he could finish the story, and so a bunch of other people of his ilk in his place wrote the end of the story for him. They're slightly different versions, but not very, very different. This story, the very unique story, actually is more of a beginning than an end. It appears in the manuscript as one of the continuations, even though it's actually a beginning. It's called the Elucidation, and it's believed to have been written by a Welsh storyteller who brought that story from Britain to France at around that time. So that story, one of our oldest stories from these islands that we can trace, shows us very clearly a land in which it is important for people to live in balance and harmony with the land, and to respect the wisdom, knowledge, life-giving, nourishing force of the otherworld which flows into it. So I find that very powerful, that is in our oldest mythology. I find it curious as well that it's a story that very, very few people have ever heard.
Well, Sharon, thank you so much. It's such a timely story as well. Like the more you spoke, the more it felt like something that was happening in our present right now.
Yeah.
From the way the man who took everything, the violation and the rape, and then the laying of the land to waste, and then the Fisher King, the land of the Fisher King not being there anymore, and you can't revive it. It feels almost as though it was a story written for today. Yeah. And strange as well, because at that time you wouldn't have thought that there would have been fear of lack of abundance. So I wonder why the story was told so long ago, and if you have any inkling of why that might have been.
I don't know specifically why, but what I can say is that throughout, and you know, you mentioned at the beginning that we were talking about the myths and ancestral traditions of Britain. I should include Ireland in that too, because we have a lot more information from Ireland than we actually do from Britain, so it's inevitable that we use lots of examples there. But in those old traditions, in the very oldest stories, if you broke the contract with the land, if you did not respect it and live in balance and harmony with it, and if you didn't live in balance and harmony with the other world, the moral authority of which was always represented by women, then bad stuff happened. And the land either became a wasteland, we see that in both Irish and Welsh mythology, or it became flooded. It was kind of like, you know, from one extreme to the other. So we have stories of wastelands happening for lack of balance and respect, and we have stories of lands being flooded and pretty much wiped out by the waters for lack of balance and respect. But what is very clear at the heart of all of these old stories, the stories in the oldest texts that we have from these islands, and the stories in the oral tradition that have survived into close to the present day, that concept of living in balance and harmony with the land is absolutely critical. And it kind of breaks my heart a little bit that more people don't know about this, because, you know, we tend these days to go looking for our wisdom in other parts of the world. We look to Native Americans, we look to Taoism in China, or, you know, all kinds of other traditions, and they're very wonderful traditions, don't get me wrong, but we have it here as well. And the fact that we are not taught about that we're not taught to see these stories in the context of cosmology, of worldviews, of spirituality, of ideas and rules, if you like, that people lived by, is a real tragedy, I think, for us. So that's my passion, is kind of like, you know, to bring that back to people and say, look, we have it here. It taught us how to live. It warned us, you know, 2,000 years ago, and we still haven't learned the lesson.
Almost wonder if it's been purposely forgotten by the other dominant narratives of kind of the Western tradition, which is very much of the king who was the violator.
Yeah, I have no doubt that it was. I mean, basically, you can see it. You can track it, particularly in the Irish textual history over time, as Christianity, you know, moved out of the kind of, you know, early Celtic Christianity into the Roman Catholicism, which was more hierarchical and patriarchal, run from the continent. You see women's roles basically being written out of history, because in these older stories, you know, the voices of the wells were women. in the oldest stories of Ireland, which are the oldest in these islands, women were they personified the land. They held the power of the land, and they also held and like meted out the moral authority of the otherworld. And this is not my opinion. For clarity, there are lots of crusty elderly male folklorists in universities around Ireland who say, gosh, it's really amazing. You know, early Irish cosmology was intensely female-centered. And it's not that there weren't deities who were gods as well as the divine feminine, but they just played a slightly different kind of role. Whenever anything was happening that was big, it was the otherworldly women who pretty much ran the show. And that's really very interesting to me to have discovered over these last few years.
And what do you mean exactly by the other world? Do you mean the sacred, the more than human, the spirits of the land? Like, is there what is the other world?
Well, I'll put it as briefly as I can. It's very clear again in the old text that the other world is not a place. So it's not somewhere you go. It's kind of a different layer which is superimposed on this world. So you can access the other world pretty much from anywhere. It's kind of like, it's almost like if you were to pierce through a kind of veil. That's the best analogy that I like to use. So here's the world of our physical senses. Every now and again, in certain places or at certain times of year, the veil becomes a little bit thin, and you can see through it to a different layer of reality. So this idea of the other world really is no different from that of many ancient traditions where they looked at different layers of reality, world upon world upon world, you know, beginning with the physical world, but continuing with all kinds of other layers of reality which influenced and often directed this world. So we are very much in line with the other ancient traditions here.
It's interesting to see how directly related actions in this world are with actions in the other world, and the repercussions of your actions, the impact they have on the planet, and the kind of contract being so interlinked with your actions as an individual. And I can imagine the sense of agency there is completely different to what you might find in other more ideological or dogma-based religions like Christianity or like later institutionalized religion, where it was much more around what happened to you in the afterlife rather than your impact on like the planetary balance.
Absolutely. All of these ancient traditions, you know, ancient Greek philosophy, Plato and all of these guys, ancient Sufi philosophy, all of them have this sense of us embedded and having our agency in the physical world, you know, that we chose as souls. Plato argued that we chose as souls to come here to be physically incarnated in this world. And so what happens to us in this world is absolutely critical. There is no transcendental out there that matters. And yet there are these layers of reality. There are these other levels of perception that are beyond the world of our physical senses, which we can interact with. And so the old stories of these islands tell us we can interact with the other world. You know, it's not closed to us. You just have to A, know it's there, and B, figure out how you can actually get to practice it. But this idea of the other world as a world, a kind of an imaginal world. So the Sufis would have called it the imaginal world, and it was a world for them that existed between the world of our physical senses and the abstract intellectual stroke spiritual world. The imaginal world is the place where stories lived, where archetypes lived, where God, the creatures, the beings that we call deities, gods and goddesses lived, where angels lived, if you prefer that language in the Sufi tradition. And these were kind of beings who could act as soul guides, psychopomps, a beautiful Greek word, old Greek word, which I love, soul guides, to draw us into relationship with the world soul, with the anima mundi, which was kind of above and beyond us. And that once upon a time, people understood that this was an important and necessary thing to do, because that's how you keep everything alive. But we have forgotten that over the past, certainly, couple of thousand years. And we've entered into a very scientistic, mechanistic, rationalistic paradigm where we're taught to see all of that kind of stuff as just made up, as fantasy. But back in the day, throughout the world, for most of human history, it's a bit of an aberration, the past few hundred years, most of human history, we believed that there were these levels of reality, that they mattered to our journey as individual souls on this earth, and also to the well-being of the planet, of the ecosystem, of the ecology, of the cosmology of the universe too.
Colin Campbell talks about that we're suffering from a crisis of relationship. And I love how these stories, or the story that you just told, is so much about relationships and existing in relationship with the planet, with other beings, with the anima mundi, with ourselves. And it's a much more holistic paradigm. Are there any other examples of this archetype of the woman as mediator of balance from other traditions, or like the wise woman, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sticking to Britain and Ireland as we talk. I mean, I should say that the voices of the wells, the otherworldly women, in the Irish tradition particularly, and there's certainly also some evidence of this in Wales, the goddesses, the great goddesses of our tradition were goddesses of the land. And, they embodied a quality of the land which was called sovereignty. Now, sovereignty has nothing to do with personal power, nothing at all. That's a modern interpretation of it. Sovereignty is the ability of the goddess of the land to choose the rightful king. And I have to say that there is a balance here. We're talking about women at the moment, but the masculine, the just masculine, full of integrity and discernment and judgment, was also absolutely critical. And right up into the 16th century in Ireland, there was a sacred marriage between the goddess of the land and the king. There were literally rights of kingship included the king marrying the goddess of the land to keep this contract that we're talking about in that story that I told. So this is absolutely critical. So we have women as all the way through these old mythologies as representing the power of the land and the other world that is entwined within the land. But the wise woman is another interesting character who comes more from the oral tradition. And again, this is very clear in Ireland and to a lesser extent in Scotland. And there are odd little examples of it around and about as well. In Ireland, the wise woman is called the ban feasa, literally the woman of wisdom. And the ban feasa is not a wise woman who, as in many traditions, works purely with herbs or with physical healing. She's kind of like the village psychologist. And her role is to step in when people have messed up their relationship with the other world, either on an individual level or on a community level. So she intercedes between the people and the other world. And so we have all of these wonderful stories. I suppose the most famous wise woman in this tradition would have been a woman called Biddy Early from County Clare in Ireland. And she literally, if something happened, if somebody was, as they said, away with the fairies, if somebody had a psychological breakdown, or if somebody's cows were dying or something else was happening in the village that was bad, she would go and talk to the fairies being the more modern name for the old gods of the land, the characters that lived in the other world. And she would intercede on behalf of the people and ask what needed to be done to put the balance right again. So this idea of the wise woman as a kind of almost shamanic role of interceding for the community with the other world is absolutely inherent in our tradition. It's not just about physical healing. In fact, if you look at herbalism, it's very interesting. I'm kind of like getting diverted a little bit, so I'll make this really short. In herbalism, in our ancient traditions, a herb was no good unless you had a ritual, a chant, an invocation to the power of the plant, which brought the other world into the equation. The physical properties of the plant were no good. You had to have this imaginal layer, this otherworldly layer that looked at the plant and kind of, embroiled it, if you like, in the healing process. So this sense of the otherworld being necessary part of everything is absolutely inherent in our traditions.
Well, that's so powerful to think about, this role of ritual and ceremony and almost intention. It's like it's nothing unless you bring the intention to it, and you can create a kind of a magic in a way. Would it have been understood as magic then, or was it much more about healing and just how things were? And also, I always understood a lot of these ancient traditions to have this emphasis on practice, enchantment, and embodiment, like what I've kind of come to understand through stereotype of witches, for example. And what might an authentic contemporary earth-based spirituality look like in this context and in the context of the mythic imagination? And like if it is about recreating ritual and ceremony or different approaches, what would that look like?
Okay, that's two big questions, and I'm gonna go to the first one, and then if I get carried away and I forget the second one, come back to me.
Okay.
I don't know what labels they would have put on it. They might, whether they would have used magic or any other words, but it's very, very clear that in the ancient bardic tradition, words weren't enough. So the bards were poets, but they believed that the inspiration, that their words came from the other world, that the inspiration came from the other world. And this happened by them putting themselves into trance states, by various means. We don't know all of them, unfortunately. Not very much was written down about specific practices in which they would interact with the other world. But it's very clear, for example, that if words were said, curses, for example, in certain physical stances, like standing on one leg with one hand behind your back, this kind of like, asymmetry was very powerful in many shamanic traditions around the world, then boy, they really had whack. They had a really big whack. And the point was that in various physical stances, various kinds of invocation, various, yes, I suppose you could call it intent, you were tapping right into the other world and bringing the power of the other world back. So in the case of herbalism, for example, and we see this very, very widely in Scotland in particular, you want to bring the plant, you want to bring that otherworldly, imaginal, mythical layer of the plant into the physical layer of the plant, and for both of them, both aspects, the physical and the imaginal, mythic, to take part in the healing. And so by telling the plant, for example, by saying charms over the plant, like how wonderful it was, what a beautiful plant it was, how wonderful that it would help, heal this person, you're kind of like, you were courting the plant. And all of our ancient traditions are about courting. It's about praising. You praise a tree, you tell it how wonderful it is, it'll grow. You praise a field, you tell it how fine its crops are, it'll give you more crops. You praise a herb, you tell it how much you respect it and how much you need its help, and it will help you. So there was this genuine sense of the entire world as animate, not just the plant world, the animal world as well. And so we see the wisdom of animals everywhere in Celtic and British mythology. So, in the old folk stories, gosh, if you wanted to know where some treasure was hidden and nobody in the village remembered, and then you went to the oldest people in the next village and they didn't remember, and you got older and older and older in the human tradition, nobody remembered, then you would go to the animals. And eventually you'd end up with the oldest animal, and the animals always knew more than we did. And so there was this great respect for the wisdom of a crow or the wisdom of a fox, which was different to ours, which, they knew something that we didn't and that we sometimes needed. So that sense of relationship, of kinship, is absolutely threaded through. So yes, ritual, charm, incantation, it's an act of relationship, it's an act of speaking, it's an act of acknowledging your place in a very, very wide web, of which the plant that you want to bring in is, you know, is part of that web and has to be invited, courted. That is clear. So a contemporary, to me, the short answer, and you'll have to ask me another question because I've got too long an answer here. The short answer to your question about what an authentic contemporary spirituality looks like is, to me, it's really very simple. It's like you accept that in the world today. You accept that a tree is to be courted, a crow is to be courted, is to be praised, is to be spoken to, is that you respect, you listen, you sit and you listen. It's like those wonderful old stories from indigenous tribes in the Amazon, where, you know, people go in and say, well, how do you know what this plant does? And they say, the plant told us. That's because they sat and listened. They entered into conversation. They engaged with the plant imaginally to see what it might be. And to me, that is the most fundamental aspect of a contemporary spirituality. Is we don't go in there casting spells on things and all of that malarkey. We court something to help us, if it's appropriate, achieve a particular end.
It's kind of a complete reversal of the idea of the spell maker, in a way, because you're listening instead of enchanting. You're just listening for the enchantment to take place.
Yeah.
And creating the space for something to arise.
Yeah.
Which is, I suppose that could completely transform how you view your relationship with the other world, in a way.
Yeah, I think it could. I mean, there's another wonderful story, you know, because obviously my background is in both psychology, sorry about all the ologies, psychology and mythology. Although I grew up in a very scientistic kind of psychology, I managed to train myself out of that and turn to the work of Jung. And Jung has this wonderful story which he heard from a guy called Richard Wilhelm, who was a friend of his, and told it very often. And it's a story called The Rainmaker. And Wilhelm, at the time, Jung's friend, was in China, and there was basically a drought and rain would not come. And so ultimately, many, many months on, they sent to the next village for the rainmaker, and the rainmaker came, and he went into a hut by himself for 3 days, and then the rains came. So Wilhelm, who was a Western man, went to the rainmaker and said, how did you do that? How did you make the rains come? And the rainmaker said, well, I didn't make the rains come. It just, you know, that's not how it works. And so Wilhelm said, well, how does it work? And he said, well, I came from a country that was in Tao. Tao, in this sense, being in flow, in balance, in harmony with the world. And when I came here, the land was out of Tao. And so I sat in the hut and I waited for 3 days until I was back in Tao and the land was back in Tao, and then naturally the rains came of their own accord. So there this sense of the rainmaker. He didn't make rain. He participated in a process which was a co-creative process with the land, of harmony and balance, of creating the conditions in which rain could come. And that is absolutely, you're quite right, very, very different from this idea of the spell maker, where we are the powerful ones, we're the witches, we're the wizards, we're the druids, we're we're the shamans, whatever. We go in there and make it happen. No, not in any of these old traditions does that happen. You court, you ask, and if you're very, very lucky, stuff happens.
I love that so much. It reminds me also of more traditional ways of farming, which seem to be much more co-creative. And it's like working with the soil, working with the plant, rather than more industrialized agriculture, which is much more like, here are our machines, we're going to plow this, like completely different approach.
Absolutely.
So you mentioned Jung before. When I think of Jung, I think automatically of archetypes. And this evening we've been talking about this archetypal understanding of womanhood as intermediary. But I'm sure that there were other archetypes, or was it that all women were intermediaries? And was it a sense that many people played different roles to uphold this larger sense of balance? Or was it much more that everybody was intermediary, all female archetype was the same?
No, I mean, there are various archetypes. You know, we have the old woman archetype in the Gaelic stroke Gaelic tradition in Ireland, Scotland, the Isle of Man, the old woman of the world, the Cailleach, she is called, the old woman who created and shaped the land. That's a quite different archetype. That's not so much an intermediary. We have all kinds of different archetypes, but I suppose what I'm trying to say, intermediary isn't the word I suppose that I would use for the archetype, but what they are is they're kind of like purveyors of the power of the other world. They are the other world incarnate, but because the other world is so enfolded in the land, they're also the land incarnate. And in these traditions, you just can't separate the two. The land and the other world are the same. There's a wonderful old Irish story in Imrama Bran, the adventure of Bran, where, to cut a very long story short, Bran is the king of roundabout what's modern day the city of Derry, and he's out hunting with his men one day, and he finds a beautiful woman, a beautiful otherworldly woman carrying a silver tinkling branch, who captures his heart, and eventually, anyway, he goes home. She follows him. She invites him to the land of women. Come, she says, to the land of women. There's only women there, and we haven't got any men. Why don't you and your men come? So, not surprisingly, the next morning, Bran and his men hotfoot it down to the shore, and they get in their coracles, and they go looking for the Isle of Women, which she has said is across the sea. While they're looking for the Isle of Women, all of a sudden, on the ocean, out of the sea pops this wonderful old god, Manannán mac Lia, Manannán, son of the sea. And Manannán says to Bran, you think you're on a coracle, don't you? You think you're on a boat? And Bran says, yes, I do. You think you're sailing across the sea, don't you? And Bran says, yes, I do. And Manannán goes into some long spiel about how, to him, Manannán, Bran is actually in a golden wheeled chariot, riding across the flower-filled plains of Magmel, and that wave over there, that thing that Bran thinks is a wave, is actually the hill of something which I can never remember. And so this whole idea of the other world and the physical world being just different ways of looking at the same thing is absolutely critical. And so the women are kind of part and parcel of that, but it's always the otherworldly woman who invites the hero to adventure. You know, the otherworldly woman who says, come and have your initiation in the other world. You look like the right kind of guy. Let's test your mettle. It's always the woman who is the initiator of the action when something needs to shift or change or to be won. And I suppose that's probably the key archetype, feminine archetype in the old stories.
And I've heard you talk about reclaiming ancient roles, and I've just this word reclaim. So it's like reclaiming our voices as women, or using these ancient stories to help us to find purpose and to find out our roles in the world today. And I just wanted to know what you mean by reclaiming, and if there is ever any conflict between these very ancient understandings of womanhood with the woman understood today. And yeah, I just would love to hear you talk a bit about that.
Yeah. I don't believe in going back. I'm not a reconstructionist. I think the idea that we can reconstruct a contemporary spirituality based on our ancestral traditions is doomed to failure. We just don't know what they were. Sorry. We have some clues in the old texts. We have some clues and traditions that are passed on in the oral culture, but nobody wrote them down. So, the monks in the monasteries wrote down many of the old stories and poems. They did not write down the teachings of the Druids. It was a competing religion. They weren't going to do that. So there's not much we can do, even if we wanted to do. But to me, it doesn't make any sense. This was 2,000 years ago. The world is very, very different. We're different. We've learned some things. We failed in many things, And so it really is a question of going back to the core of the belief system about balance, about living in balance, about living in harmony, taking inspiration from that is our legacy, that is our lineage. This is who we once were. We can be that again. So when I'm talking about reclaiming, it's very much that sense of our people were not always like this. We didn't always live in the wasteland. We understood that too much was too much. We understood when to stop. We understood how to respect the land. We understood how to journey into the other world and the necessity of that. And those very general ideas are what I would like to see brought back to the world today. And when we were talking about this session, Ruby, you and I were talking about the kind of the oracular tradition, which is a big tradition in many parts of Europe. I suppose we think very much of ancient Greece and the female oracles that are so famous there. And to me, the oracular tradition in our ancestry is very much about listening to the other world, because the oracles in ancient Greece and everywhere else were the ones who listened to the other world, who tried to tune in, who tried to pierce the veil, who tried to listen to the guidance, who were looking for the psychopomps, the soul guides, to give them clues. And I think that, today we don't know exactly how our ancestors did it. We have some clues. Today, we have a lot of different techniques, for want of a better word, that allow us to tap into the other world, or the imaginal world, if you prefer that, which have come from all kinds of wonderful traditions over the past 2,000 years. So one of the, Jung, for example, who is clearly a hero of mine as a psychologist, was very, very clear in his later years, particularly in the whole post-Jungian strand of archetypal psychology, which tells us that your night dreams are not just products of your unconscious. That would be very dull anyway, wouldn't it? But actually, it is the anima mundi. It's the soul of the world. It's the imaginal world trying to get through to our thick skulls at a point where, we haven't got our defenses up anymore, and trying to help us. So soul guides come to us in our night dreams, if only we can learn to listen to them. Jung had another technique called active imagination, which is very much about, let's say, there were many ways of doing it, but let's say a figure came to you in a night dream and you didn't really understand what it was trying to tell you, or you hadn't got a clue. You would go to that figure in a kind of daydream, if you like, a kind of trance-like state during the day, and you would try to engage it in conversation to see what it had to tell you, recognizing that it was an image, a being, an archetype that had come to you out of the imaginal world, that had a life and an intention of its own. And boy, you treated it with respect and you asked it for help. You didn't direct it to tell you. And this was another way of engaging with the imaginal world and with the other world. Divination, symbolic languages like astrology and tarot are, in this way of looking at the world, ways in which we can gain knowledge and guidance from the other world, using that language, that symbolic language, the language of images, to communicate with us. What I think is particularly important today is also listening to the land, what I've described over many, many years as falling into the land's dreaming, listening to the land's dreaming, sitting in a place, closing your eyes, looking at a crow, not trying to overinterpret, not blundering in, but just like sitting, and as well as understanding the physical aspects of the trees and the ecology and the animals, looking for the mythical overlay. What is crow? We know it's a black bird and that he has these particular behaviors, and it's very important to understand the physical world. But what is crow as an image, as an idea, as an archetype? And what is that particular crow up there saying to us, if anything? That sense of listening for clues, that is, to me, our native. All of these things are part of a contemporary spirituality based on the oracular, which is very much tied into our old traditions too.
That's so beautiful. I love the interrelationship between dreaming and listening, and this different understanding of place, of our place within a much more cyclical reality, where we are all entangled, all the different lives are entangled with one another. And the crow affects us just as much as we affect the land that we're on, and we affect the crow. And when we talk about falling into the land's dreaming, it brings up this other phrase of dreaming the land. And is dreaming the land, is that also referring to a listening to the land?
That's not a phrase that I would use. I mean, to me, the land's dreaming is kind of like it's this mythic overlay. So I think of the land's dreaming as the imaginal overlay, the otherworldly overlay on the physical world. So when we're falling into the land's dreaming, we're falling into the other world. In a sense, you know, we're in the physical world, and it has to be grounded. It really, really has to be grounded. So it's important to know what a crow is in the physical world, to understand its behavior, its characteristics, because then you know what's different apart from anything else. You know, you're not going to make silly mistakes. But the dreaming of the land is the mythical overlay, the imaginal overlay on the physical world that we can tap into by beginning with the physical crow that we know and that we love and that we understand, and yet just piercing it so that we see crow as something else. To me, crow is a trickster. You know, that's the mythical archetype that I think of as crow. And when I look at crow, I'm always looking for a disruption, for some, you know, for some cackle to be pointed at me, like, you know, you think you're so clever, I'll show you, kind of thing. It's just the way that I look at crow. Every bird, every element of the land and the places, every rock, to me has a mythic overlay. It means something to me that's over and above, or very much entwined with its physical characteristic. And that's what I mean by falling into the land's dreaming, where that practice becomes so natural to us that we are genuinely a part of that conversation that the land is having with all of the inhabitants. And we're not, for once, you know, sitting outside of it, looking at it, but we're an intrinsic part of it, if that makes sense. Dreaming the land to me is more active. You know, again, it has this connotation of humans are going to dream the land into being, and that's not how maybe that's not how the phrase would be meant, but that's, to me, that's a slightly different emphasis.
Yeah, no, it's totally. I'm seeing your understanding is much more around receptivity and a much more opening and reawakening to the depth of what is out there. But it's like we have to reopen our eyes and listen and become more attuned and more aware. I really loved your book, Re-enchantment, and read it so many times and organized events around it. and this whole idea that we've fallen out of love with the earth, and it's clear from the way we treat it, and like, how can we fall back in love with the earth? It's similar in a way to this idea of listening again for something more, and I wonder if that's how you reached this idea.
I guess it's something, you know, it's something that I have done. It is about listening and receptivity to the land. It's also about conversation and engaging in speech with the land, because I think the land likes to hear our voices, just like it likes to hear the voice of a crow, but actually, you know, directed at it rather than at each other. So there's a very fine thing in just saying a poem to a tree, or telling a story to a rock. And that sense of relationship, that sense of engagement, to me is a whole big part of it. And if we were to see ourselves as engaged in this conversation rather than as separate from the land, then I think that sense of falling in love with the land would automatically come. And now I have completely forgotten the second part of your question. I'm so sorry. I lost it.
Oh no, I was just asking. I think you answered it. I was just asking, like, what inspired you?
Oh, I see. Yeah. And that's what I was going to say. That for at least the past, I haven't always been like this. You know, I've learned too in my life, but at least for the past decade, every morning, or sometimes later in the day, if it just works out that has to be the case. But pretty much every morning of my life, I go out there and I address my land. I talk to it. I honor it. I acknowledge the directions. I acknowledge the birds and the creatures that are around me, and I say something to it. And that practice of just doing that, of acting as if it is alive, well, it's not acting as if it is alive. I know it's alive. Just you're in it. It doesn't require any more than that. That isn't to me a separate ritual or something that I would do for, a month or 3 months or whatever. It's something I do every day of my life. I go out there, I talk to it, I'll sprinkle a few herbs or, make an offering or whatever I can do. And that's me trying to find my way, my place in the land.
There's one thing I would love to bring up bring emphasis to is the word you used, practice. I feel practice is something so important when it comes to engaging with a spirituality of some sort, especially this, where it's how we're engaging with the earth. And this idea of practice, and also before you said it was so important for things to be grounded, and the role of practice in integrating the other world into our lives and making it kind of very grounded and very in the now. And I can imagine it being easy to get lost and having difficulties in integration. So I wonder if that's a role you see of practice, as a kind of integration of these ideas.
I think practice is a habit. I think practice is, to me, is about getting into a habit, because it for most of us this is not normal behavior. And a lot of it, a lot of the psychology that I used to practice back in the day, the therapy when I was practicing as a therapist, was about just suggesting that people act as if. I know you don't believe that the world is this way, but how would it be if you acted as if it was for a little while and then see what happens? And I think that what we're doing when we first begin to engage in these practices is we're just acting as if the world is alive, even if we're not entirely sure and we think it's all a bit woo-woo. And then one day you find out actually something really remarkable happens and it is alive and it smacks you in the face and life is never the same again. So that is the point of practice for me. It's not about discipline. It's not like going to church, and that would be terrible. The world doesn't want that. The world wants your spontaneity. The world wants wants you to want it. It is courting. It's like a love relationship. And to me, to go out there and to have this conversation with bits of the land, wherever it might be that I end up, is a joy. It's not a discipline. It was probably at first. It's not anymore. And watching that transformation, in my case, over a period of years, watching the way in which I can see that the land is interacting back with me is the biggest blessing, I think, of my life. And all of that comes from a knowledge of our that initial delving into our native traditions. And I'm seeing that that Zach has on the chat box here, where he's looking for interactions now from the audience. He has a question here: what is your favorite or most valuable lesson learned from our native British myths and stories? And to me, it is about that. It's about that act of reciprocity, that act of relationship, that talking to the land, that speech. You speak to the land, you speak to the animals as if you are in a conversation, like you're expecting something back. You're not talking at it, you're expecting something back, and you're listening for as long as it takes, because it doesn't always come straight away, because we're not taught to do this stuff. So that is my most valuable lesson, that we have to act as if we're in relationship, that speech is not just about us imposing or spell casting, as you put it, that it is about, it's really co-creation's a really, that can be a dodgy word, but it really is, in this sense, very much about co-creation.
Thank you, Sharon. I would love to invite anybody who's watching this to write questions in the comments of Facebook or YouTube, and we'll see them, and Sharon can answer them directly. I'll just pick out one person has said that they'd love to know where they can read the Voices of the Wells story.
Oh, well, that's a difficult one. You can find it online. It's not in any of the fairy tale or folktale books. You can find it online. You'd have to Google the elucidation, And there's Rochester. There's a website which I can't remember the full address of, but if you Google it, it'll be very easy. The elucidation, I think it's rochester.edu, which is a US university website where they put the original text, which was in Chrétien de Troyes' Perceval, and you could read it there.
Thanks, Sharon. Somebody else, it's not a question, but they said that their husband just messaged them a picture of a crow, just as you're talking about crows.
Of course.
Talking
Crows everywhere.
Yeah, maybe that would be an interesting thing to touch on quickly. Is you spoke about Trickster and the crow, and in this time we're in, you might say that the Trickster is around. And how does Trickster interrelate with this idea of balance that we've been discussing just now?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge subject, but briefly, the role of Trickster, the Trickster archetype around the world, and Trickster appears in different cultures in different ways. So in some places, Trickster is a comic, just a funny guy. In some places, he's a little bit darker, like Loki in Norse mythology. But the role of Trickster always is to disrupt. The role of Trickster is to show up ridiculous stuff for what it is. So when we're very full of ourselves and very arrogant and very pleased with ourselves, along comes Trickster with a mirror to say, actually, I think you'll find you look really stupid when, it's a bit Emperor's New Clothes. You look really stupid when you put those clothes on. And it's always a disruptor. He's always holding up a mirror to the culture and to the individual, depending on, which level you're looking at it. And so, there is a way in which you could argue that this virus is a Trickster virus. The mirror that it's holding up to our culture is that we've taken too much, that we've not respected animals, that we've not respected the ecosystem. It's one way of looking at it. But I think that Trickster is a particularly powerful archetype at the moment. We are in Trickster times. Back when Donald Trump was elected in 2016, I wrote a blog post about Trickster, basically saying, you may not get the Trickster that you want, but you always get the Trickster that you deserve. Because the role of Trickster is whenever you think, oh, we're the most morally upright, we're the most wonderful, we're the most democratic and what have you, along comes Trickster to say, this is what you voted for, this is what you are. So I think Trickster is one of my favorite archetypes of all archetypes, purely and simply because of that power. It's frightening sometimes, but Trickster is a reflection of the cultural shadow. The mirror that Trickster holds up to us is the cultural shadow. Look this in the face and deal with it, is what Trickster is saying right now.
And is Trickster, so does Trickster come when that balance has been broken? Are there any myths when Trickster and this otherworld female archetype interact?
There are lots of myths, and I don't, I'm not much of a kind of like repository of world myths, but I mean, there's one beautiful story that I love, which actually comes from a Native American tradition, but it's so similar to the traditions in our part of the world that I kind of I took it and gave it an overlay, and it will be. Maybe we could just finish with a story as well, and starting with a story. It's a very, very brief story. It's about an island which is far, far, far to the west of this particular island. It's an island that you can see on a very clear day from the westernmost shore of this island. And on the westernmost shore of that island are some very, very fine high cliffs. And it's said that in one of those cliffs lives the old woman of the world. The old woman who makes and creates and shapes the world. And if you were to find that cave where the old woman of the world lives, you would find that she's sitting on the right-hand side of the cave, and in front of her is a giant loom bigger than she is. Beautiful loom on which she is weaving what she hopes will be the most beautiful tapestry that the world has ever seen. And she's, as well as using all the beautiful golden and brightly colored threads in that tapestry, she's also weaving a fringe made of sea urchin quills, because the old woman of the world knows that everything beautiful, like the rose, has to have its pointy bits that will prick you if you got a little bit too precocious. But on the other side of the cave is a fire, and over that fire is a great black cauldron, in which is bubbling all of the herbs and all of the plants and all of the seeds of all of the growing things in this world. And it's also the old woman's job to tend that cauldron. And so every now and again, the old woman of the world has to leave what she hopes will be the most beautiful tapestry that the world has ever seen, go over to the cauldron and stir the soup so that it doesn't all burn and the world doesn't end because all of the good stuff is burned. When she does that, you would notice, if you were looking very carefully, that there's a little fluttering up in the right-hand corner of that cave. And on that shelf, right up in the top right-hand corner of that cave, is a crow. And his name is Trickster Crow. And he's lived with the old woman of the world for as long as anybody has ever been able to remember. They've always been together. She can't remember a time when Trickster Crow didn't live with her. So she's off over the other side of the cave. While she's stirring the soup, Trickster Crow jumps down from his shelf, stands in front of that beautiful tapestry. Oh, shiny threads. There's Trickster Crow gone. He pecks at this one. He pecks at that one. Before you know it, all of the threads that are going to make what is potentially the most beautiful tapestry that the world has ever seen are on the floor in a tangled mess. So the old woman of the world comes back from stirring the soup. That's what she sees. What does she do? Does she weep? Does she wail? Does she stomp out of the cave? Does she wring Trickster Crow's neck? She doesn't do any of those things. She stands there and she looks at those threads until she sees a particularly fine turquoise thread that she has always loved, and she picks that turquoise thread up and she measures it, and there it is. Before you know it, it's on the loom, and the old woman of the world is going to create the most beautiful tapestry that the world has ever seen. And the moral of this story is that the old woman of the world knows what Trickster Crow knows, which is that if the old woman of the world actually succeeded in creating the most beautiful tapestry that the world has ever seen, the world would end. That would be it. And so Trickster Crow keeps on disrupting, and the old woman of the world keeps on weaving, so that the world is always in a process of becoming, and the world never comes to an end. So that's my favorite Trickster story, and that gives me, if I'm not really much of a believer in hope, but if there is anything that gives me hope, it's just that idea of whatever we think is broken, there's always a new tapestry that we can reweave from those threads. And that's Trickster's role, to stop the world from ending by disrupting, so that we can always make it again. We can always renew it.
What an amazing story, Sharon. Thank you so much. And what a message to resilience and just acceptance as well, that it's always going to be how it comes out, because that's the plan, and we can't really make any difference anyway. We can just play our part and engage with the world as fully as we can.
Yeah,
exactly. As fully as we can. I think we should probably wrap up now, because we're ending the time. I'd love you, before we go, if you could just touch on the courses that you're offering on your website, just so that people know where they can learn more and perhaps sign up.
Sure, yeah. My website is sharonblackie.net, and on there you can find out lots of information about my books, which are on the Enchanted Life, which you've spoken about, and If Women Are As Rooted, where the Voices of the World story is dealt with in some depth. And I do run courses in two areas, really. One is kind of like reconnecting with our native roots, going back to, it's called Celtic Studies, but it's broader than Celtic Studies, going back to look at the old texts and the old oral folklore, and even the archaeology, which tells us something about our ancestors' beliefs, with the particular perspective of trying to create a contemporary authentic spirituality based on that, without trying to reconstruct. And then I have a number of other stories which are more in the kind of mythic imagination vein, which are about how the particular practices and techniques that we can use to court the world soul, to court the anima mundi, to tie ourselves into the imaginal world, to fall into the land's dreaming. So yeah, you can find all you want to know on the website.
Thank you so much, Sharon. This evening has been so inspiring, so full of wisdom, but also practices that we can take with us, or not even practices, but attitudes. Like how can we perceive ourselves within the earth differently, and our place, and the role of listening and being open, I think, are some of the key things, and the role of reclaiming the kind of ancient wisdoms and the native wisdoms, and understanding the role that they can play now, and in this time. I think that Voices of the Well story, still, I can't believe how timely it would seem. And how old would that story have been?
Oh gosh, well, it was written down in the 13th century, but there's no question that it came from a much, much older oral tradition. You can trace it back to, you can actually trace it back to Ireland and to some old stories that were written down probably around the 6th and 7th centuries.
Yeah. So exactly, those archetypes, and how we can find a lot of understanding by going back to these stories, in understanding our own roles. And a lot of purpose and belonging, often when these narratives that we are told don't suit and seem empty in comparison.
Yeah, and to have that sense that that's how, again, that is the ancestral wisdom that is our lineage, that's there for us to look into and to reclaim. Yeah.
So thank you so much, Sharon, and
Thanks, Ruby.
wrap up the evening. Thank you to everyone who joined us, and I really urge you to check out Sharon's website. And the amazing courses that she offers.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.